Hello and welcome to the lecture for week 3 of Introduction to Christian Thought. I hope that you're doing well so far and that you've been able to get your quizzes or reading reviews in. Starting to get to the point where that needs to happen. You've got your first assignment next week, which is a book review, so I hope that that's going well, that you've been able to get the book that you need to get and you've been able to start reading it. Up online on the front page of ACD Online and soon to be with the topic guides is the assessment guidelines for the Adelaide College of Divinity, so that you can have a look at that and look at things like how to present your papers and all that sort of stuff, which is in that document. So I heartily recommend having a good look at that. We had some readings this week. I hope that you enjoyed them. A couple of things to read. So chapter from McGrath, and then also the chapter from Allen and Springstead. I hope that you enjoyed them. We've got a couple of slides that have some of the tutorial questions that we talked about this week for you to have a little bit of a look at and think about, what is it that I should think about these readings? What kind of questions should I be asking myself about them? One of the things that we did today was we talked a little bit about the philosophy. We spent quite a bit of time just the students talking to one another in the tutorial and thinking about those tutorial questions. But we also started to think about the idea of arguments and arguments that we make. As you will have seen from the chapters that you read, making arguments and logical arguments based on this Western tradition of philosophical thought was very important in theology, and it still is. In fact, for many of the essays and the papers that you write as part of your degree, it's vital that you use logic. It's vital that they make sense. It's vital that you make a good argument. So one of the things that I've done today, because I realize some of you guys are master's students, you've studied a lot before. Some of you guys, it's not your first subject, but this is a first year subject and it's in first semester. So we have a lot of new students. And so for the first term, we've got a little bit of space where we've been discussing writing assignments and things like that. So why arguments? Why do we need arguments, and particularly in essays? Why does there need to be an argument? Well, arguments are used to support and to criticize and to clarify, to support what you're trying to say, to criticize or to critique another person and their argument, and also to clarify, because often as we make arguments, we actually come to clarify and to work out what our own position is. It's the way that we put forward our point of view in terms of academic writing most of the time. An argument generally consists of a series of statements called premises, and they're given in support of a conclusion. Now, one of the things that we were talking about as we had the lecture was just the fact that philosophical writing and arguing is different to theological writing and arguing. Theology sits sort of more in the general humanities essays, so if you're familiar with those sort of essays, whereas philosophical writing can be very structured, this premise, this premise, this premise, therefore, as you might have seen in some of the readings that we've done, and certainly we'll see as we get further into this lecture. Theology essays don't need to be quite so structured, but they do need structure. They do need a logical flow. If we go to the next slide, slide number 5, you'll see all essays need to have an argument of some kind. It's one of the things that we look for in marking. What is the argument that this person is making? How are they answering the question or addressing the topic? What are they arguing? Don't just tell us all about a topic, argue for something within the topic. This is why essays are often structured with an introduction to the issue. We shouldn't just be repeating the question, but it should be clear what question you're asking. The assessment guidelines do actually ask you, particularly when you've got multiple questions to choose from, to put at the top of your paper what question you're answering. Because with some essays, and this isn't a good thing, it's actually quite difficult to tell exactly what question the person has chosen to answer. And that doesn't reflect well for the essays at all. So if you at least give us a clue by telling us, that's very helpful. So an introduction to the issue, a body, which is most of the essay, is the body of the essay. And this is where the argument is built up through your series of logical arguments. And then a conclusion. Conclusions generally shouldn't have new information, but it should gather together and mix together the results of the arguments that you have made in your paper and built up in the body of the argument, and then kind of say, and therefore this. So yes, you shouldn't be adding lots of new footnotes or anything like that into your conclusion at all. So arguments are critical when we come to do theology, but they often have a philosophical base. Even the way that we argue has a philosophical base. It's not straight philosophy, but it certainly uses some of their thinking and some of their ways of working. So there are some arguments that are more helpful and more convincing than others. You've probably heard arguments from people, maybe from politicians, maybe just from friends, maybe when you're having drinks in the pub or coffee at a coffee shop, that you've gone, that argument, I'm just not sure it makes sense. One of the things that I've done this week is we've got a podcast called Philosophize This, which is done by a guy named Stephen West, who is American, and he puts some philosophical concepts very simply in his podcast. He just makes them simple and easy, so if you're quite familiar with philosophy, you'll go, gosh, there's a lot more to that than he's saying. But for those of us who are less familiar with philosophy, it's just very useful. It's a great entry point. And this particular podcast that I've linked for today has a lot of information about what makes good arguments and what makes bad arguments. So West is talking about philosophical fallacies and fallacies that we use in arguments. We're going to go through them in just a minute, but please do listen to the podcast and then come back to the lecture. I think the podcast goes for about 30 minutes or so. So you've got less of me and more of Stephen West today. So I will stop this part of the lecture now and I'll let you listen to the podcast, and then I'll come back for the rest of the lecture. Happy listening.